Welcome back to the ABF Journal Podcast. Today, we're diving into a fascinating paradox currently playing out in the global markets. We've seen a resurgence in deal making, with global deal values climbing to 4.5 trillion this past year. But as the volume goes up, so does the friction. According to the newly released 2026 BRG M&A Disputes Report, more than 80% of deal makers reported an increase in dispute activity last year, and most expect that trend to accelerate, particularly in the private equity and middle market sectors. Today, we're going to be breaking down those findings with two experts from BRG. Let's jump in. Hi, everyone. I'm Rita Garwood, editor-in-chief of ABF Journal. Joining me on the podcast today are Frank Dery and Kevin Hagon. Could you two introduce yourselves and let our listeners know a little bit about yourselves?
Sure, Rita. Thanks a lot. My name's Frank Dery. I'm a managing director with BRG. I'm located in our Chicago practice. I've spent the first 20 years of my career with Big Four. I've been with BRG for the past 3 years, focusing on M&A disputes and litigation investigations, mostly in North America, but with some cross-border deals. Kevin?
Yeah, my name's Kevin Hagon. I'm a director in the London office of BRG, also working on a lot of work out of APAC. My background combines quite a big part of my career in investment banking, working on M&A transactions for the most part. I also spent some time at a UK corporate negotiating as a principal in M&A transactions, and I've been at BRG for the last 10 years.
Thank you. So I have a question for you. I was reviewing the recent report that BRG put out about M&A disputes. And before we start getting into the technical drivers, I wanted to start with a headline stat from that report. Why is a resurgent deal market actually creating more conflict rather than smoother exits?
Kevin, let me jump in on this one and I'll let you add on. But I think that it's really a numbers game when you get down to it. So I think that the more deals you have, the more likely there is to be a dispute at some point. And as buyers look to enter the market and sellers look to sell, years ago it might just be the best of the best companies were being sold, and now sellers see an opportunity to sell maybe companies that they couldn't sell a couple years ago, and buyers are eager to jump into the market. So as the deal volume dries up or drives higher, you end up with maybe less desirable companies being bought and sold, and that just naturally leads to more disputes. But Kevin, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. There was definitely a period where certainly private equity were struggling to exit a lot of their positions and were getting quite lengthy in the length of time they'd been holding those. So I think as those opportunities to exit get a little bit higher, there's going to be some deals that the private equity is going to be very keen to do. And so there might be a bit of a rush to get those done. And when things get rushed, then things get done in the wrong way, and that leads to disputes.
That makes sense. So one of the most striking stats from the report that I saw is that while 65% of the people that you surveyed for that expected dispute volumes to rise, a higher 72% predict that average dispute values will grow. What's driving these bigger claims, and why is North America expected to see the most significant increase in dispute value?
Rita, I think the North American market, I think, is unique because we're, fairly used to or accustomed to working capital disputes and earnout disputes and breaches of reps and warranty. And I think that the introduction of the rep and warranty insurance has just created a boom for not necessarily for the disputes practice, but it's a lot easier now for buyers to file a rep and warranty claim than to, say, sue the sellers in court and have to deal with that dynamic. So I think that the driver and overall volume of disputes is really the introduction of rep and warranty. And then you've got a lot of earnouts coming due, and those disputes are making their way now where there's an actual dispute versus maybe negotiations or something like that. But the reason the dollar value of the disputes is getting bigger is that if you're filing a breach and rep and warranty claim, those just tend to be larger disputes and implicate financial statements and historical practices. So now you've got the combination of a higher volume of disputes and the higher dollars associated with those disputes through the rep and warranty claims. And Kevin, maybe you can provide some feedback on the APAC region because I think it's probably a slightly different dynamic there.
Yeah, I think another aspect is the kind of volatility of valuations. So if you've got more kind of shock value to the value being negotiated and people are exposed to shifts in value that are bigger, then you might end up with bigger disputes. So for example, if you have a warranty dispute and the resolution to that is comparing what the business is worth compared to what was paid or what was expected at the time of the deal, then if you have kind of volatility in that value outcome, then you could end up with a bigger dispute because you've got a bigger drop in value, for example, and the buyer's trying to claim that back.
So the report also notes that 90% of the growth in disputes occurred in deals valued under 1 billion. Why is the middle market currently the eye of the storm for M&A conflict?
From my perspective, it's a couple things. First is that there's just a larger number of deals that are under $1 billion getting done. So it becomes a numbers game again that the more deals you have getting done, the more disputes you're going to have. But separately, in my experience, I've seen the middle market, they tend to take these issues personally and they want to ride it through to the end. And I've had clients tell me in the past, hey, if they're carving out businesses, non-core businesses, in the first or second time they do that and somebody comes back and files a claim, they're going to take that all the way to the mat because they got to send a message to the market that they're not going to be negotiating away value on, the next 10 carve outs that they do. So I think that there's strategy involved in it, but I also think at the end of the day, it's just a higher volume of deals under $1 billion driving a lot of that deals growth or the disputes growth.
And you sometimes get the profile where if a founder is involved, you get more of a kind of emotional or personal reaction to a dispute, and therefore maybe less likely to settle, more likely to take it through to a later stage in the process because it means a lot more to them.
Clearly, yes. So another stat, 41% of PE respondents agree that private equity involvement increases dispute risk, yet they're also more likely to settle. How do PE firms balance being contentious with their reputation for being commercially pragmatic when a deal goes sideways?
Kevin, maybe I'll take it from
Yeah,
the U.S. perspective here because
sure.
I mean what I've always heard the kind of like the rumor, right, that when private equity is involved, you're more likely to end up in a dispute or something like that. But I think what I see is that you have a contract, right? When you enter into these merger agreements, the parties have a contract. And I think that private equity is more willing to enforce the terms of that contract, at least in the first and second instance. But at the end of the day, private equity or corporates, it's all about running the business and getting your value from operating the business. So I think that private equity is willing to enforce those contractual terms, but at the end of the day, they don't want to spend, millions of dollars disputing something if they don't have to, when the real kind of like return for them is going to be on integrating the business, getting the business, and maximizing the value of the business. So I think it goes to, yeah, they may be more willing to enforce a term early on, but they're also looking for a reasonable off ramp or commercial off ramp at the back end.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think there is a tension there that they are kind of potentially quite litigious at the beginning of the process, but have a bit of an aversion to going all the way to the end and having certainly a court process. Possibly arbitration is a bit more attractive. But there's a bit of a tension there because you don't want to be the dog that only barks but doesn't bite. So I think if a private equity firm gets a reputation for kind of not really going all the way through with the process, but always litigating, then they maybe will be seen through that process eventually if they don't kind of eventually take something all the way to its conclusion.
So I wanted to talk about geopolitical turmoil, which there's a lot going on in the world right now. It's jumped 10 percentage points as a leading dispute driver for 2026. How are specific events like tensions with China or intervention in Latin America or everything going on in the Middle East actually manifesting as legal disputes in a purchase agreement?
Let me just say too that when we conducted the survey, this was, in end of Q3, Q4, 2025. So it was before, what happened in Venezuela, is obviously before Iran and some of these other things. So I think that the survey participants were prescient in their advice that geopolitical was going to be an issue. And I think you're going to see it, in several different ways. Just recently, Qatar, I believe, invoked force majeure on their LNG contracts. And if you have deals going on in that part of the world, the operational aspects of the business you're buying are now much different than they were maybe when you were conducting diligence, or even maybe when you signed an agreement and you're in that period between signing and closing. And those are the types of disputes that we're going to see arising from the wars. And then just thinking back a couple of years when the Ukraine and Russia conflict first emerged, we had companies that had receivables from those countries that, one day in February they were good receivables that were going to be collected, and then the next day they were, probably writing them off because of everything going on over there. So I think that there's going to be a lag from when we see the disputes arise, but I think it's all going to be, similar to those lines on the operational side, and just from a pure accounting standpoint of what you thought might have been a good asset. Now you're probably going back to revalue that asset and think through, what's going on throughout the world.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, last summer, the big issue was the tariffs, and what the effect of that was going to be. And I was part of some discussions on a panel, where the MAC clause and to what extent material adverse change would be applicable in those circumstances. You'll again have that coming up now with the current conflict. And so you could end up with deals which have been signed and should close, but somebody has got cold feet because of the impact of current events, and for trying to find a way for the conditions precedent not to be met, or for a macro clause to be invoked. And that could be a source of dispute quite easily.
And Kevin, let me just add on to that, because the tariff issue presents a corollary to what we saw during COVID in the US, when Congress changed the tax rules, and all of a sudden, companies could apply NOLs back historically, when before the tax law changed, they couldn't. And so what we saw was an interesting phenomena of sellers going back to their purchase agreements and suing buyers, and telling the buyers that they had to actually retroactively apply those NOLs to the period when the sellers owned the business, and the sellers should benefit from that change in tax law. And a lot of disputes arose, and I arbitrated some of those disputes where you had a law that wasn't even in place when the deal got signed and closed. All of a sudden, caused disputes that nobody could have foreseen at the time of signing, and we had to work our way through those issues. And I think these tariffs might be a very similar construct here.
That makes sense. So there was also a significant jump in disputes driven by macroeconomic pressures. The jump was from 19% to 29%. As interest rates shift, how are you seeing valuation uncertainty turn into formal legal battles post-closing?
Kevin, you want to handle that one?
Well, I think we've slightly covered it already, but I think if you have valuation volatility, then you're more likely to end up with one or other side regretting the value that they previously agreed to. And it's not so much the valuation shift causes directly the dispute, because it should really be the value at the time that you signed the contract, or whatever, and that shouldn't be able to change. But if the dynamic of the deal has changed, then there could be buyer or seller remorse, and therefore whatever else could be invoked to either get out of the deal or recover some value becomes more likely.
Kevin, you've noted that earnouts are being tested now as a lagging effect of post-COVID deal structures, with 35% of respondents expecting earnouts to drive disputes in 2026. What are the most common mistakes that you see and how these are drafted?
I think that there's a couple of levels to that. So one is that, so the background is that earnouts tend to be a way for two parties to get to a deal when in fact they don't really agree on the valuation. And so, the buyer thinks that, okay, well, everything goes well, I'll pay more, and that's fine because it's gone well. And the seller thinks, well, I'm going to get what I deserve because it's going to go well, and I'll eventually get what I hope for. So that's why it works as a kind of compromise mechanism. And I think in kind of 2022, coming out of COVID, there was a lot of deal flow, but there was also a lot of uncertainty. And so it was one of the ways that people got over that uncertainty and therefore became more prevalent and more important in deals getting done. But there is a lag because these tests tend to be, let's say, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years out for the contingent element of the consideration to be measured and paid. So you're then coming into like 2024, 2025, where those tests are starting to be done out of that period and continuing. And so you're then dependent upon a few things. You're dependent upon the business being structured in the same way as it was when the deal was done. And usually, if you've got a carve out or some kind of joining up of two businesses, then they're probably going to want to combine those businesses, either on the revenue side or the cost side or both. And so once that happens, what's the EBITDA of what was purchased becomes a lot less obvious. And so if you have a measure for your earnout, which is EBITDA, let's say, and that's a frequent one, you're trying to measure the EBITDA of what was originally purchased, while not really knowing the exact perimeter of that business in the context of your wider business. And even if it is still held separately, perhaps it's had its costs streamlined such that it's sharing costs with the buyer business. And so what is actually the cost line in the acquired business is a share of a wider cost base that is being allocated by the buyer across to the purchased entity. And that isn't necessarily an obvious answer. There's potentially a lot of different ways you could do that, and a lot of different bases you could apply to get different results for the cost allocation being awarded to the acquired business, which gives a different cost line in the EBITDA calculation depending on how that's done. So the seller is exposed to all of that, because if the buyer is obviously going to be inclined to favor their own position by reducing the earnout payment, and so might award more costs to the purchase business than was actually originally intended or currently justified. And so that's how, and the buyer is the one who's kind of in charge now. There's 2 or 3 years down the line, the seller doesn't really have any influence. They might have information rights, but they won't have any kind of direct influence, like usually. And so this is about seller protection. This is about what can the seller do to avoid having their earnout payment unnaturally squeezed by the way that the numbers are calculated. And so, for example, EBITDA, which is not really a well-defined term, it's not a financial reporting term formally. And so there can be arguments about what EBITDA is. If it's not closely defined in the documents, then different people can define it different ways according to their interests. And you don't want two sides to have a different definition. So you need to make sure that's nailed down up front. But then you've got other complications like, what is an exceptional item? What should be an adjustment to that EBITDA? Are there things that the buyer can exclude as revenue or add as cost? Or should they be excluding a cost because it's exceptional, but they choose not to and keep it in to keep the EBITDA down? And those kind of decisions shouldn't be arbitrary and shouldn't be based on the whim of the buyer, but can be. And so you end up with a seller potentially 2 or 3 years down the line thinking, oh, well, I know that business is doing well because I've seen in the market it's still fine. But then the EBITDA number comes in and it's small. And the reason is because some extra costs have been allocated to that business. For example, I've seen examples where, for example, central management recharges suddenly appear in the EBITDA calculation of people who have relatively low involvement in the target business. but are there appearing as a deduction to get to the EBITDA number. And obviously, the seller is not going to be very happy about that, particularly if it was never the practice of the buying business to do it that way, or for the original business to do it that way. So those are the kind of things that, as a seller, you would want to nail down as far as possible. How the business is defined, the perimeter, how the key number, for example, EBITDA, is defined, what adjustments are allowed or should be compulsory, and what leeway the buyer has to manipulate those numbers. And I think I also see examples where there's a kind of good faith statement within the SPA, which is that the numbers should be calculated in a nice way that everyone should be, happy with. And it's up to the buyer is required to avoid self-serving manipulation of the numbers, i.e., not to act in bad faith. But that kind of term is quite hard to define, and to actually enforce a failure to act in good faith is quite difficult. So I think that in the heat of a deal being done and using the earnout to get over the line, something like, oh, we won't act in bad faith, is kind of used as a kind of warm blanket to reassure the seller that everything's going to be fine. But it doesn't actually do very much in the end when it comes down to it.
Rita, maybe I'll just, because I mean, Kevin kind of hit the nail on the head there with with that answer. I mean, he covered a lot of ground, but it's all really good information. And a example from a U.S. GAAP perspective that we see quite a bit in earnouts is that typically the definition of EBITDA excludes extraordinary gains or extraordinary expenses. But the issue is that I think it was like 2014 or 2015, GAAP got rid of the concept of extraordinary expenses. So now you might have a term that's being used in a way that should be, according to the agreement, construed in accordance with GAAP, but GAAP doesn't actually define extraordinary anymore. And if the parties don't define extraordinary, I can tell you that if Kevin and I are on different sides of a deal, what's extraordinary to me might not be extraordinary to him and vice versa, right? And so those are the types of terms that the parties at the time don't think are ambiguous, but when all of a sudden you've got millions of dollars riding on it, they become very ambiguous.
And the other thing about this is that what you're usually doing is trying to agree upon, let's say, an EBITDA number, and then you're multiplying that by, let's say, 9 or 10 times to get to the consideration payment. And so there's a big magnification of any kind of disputed item in the hands of the buyer and the seller. So while even some things might seem small, but actually will be inflated by that multiple, and so soon become large.
So nearly half, about 46% of respondents cited due diligence issues as a primary dispute factor. In the race to close deals in a competitive market, what critical steps are being skipped that lead to these unanticipated post-closing challenges?
It's a good question, and I'm not so sure that it's steps being skipped as much as it is, steps being moved through quickly to get a deal done or to get the diligence done so that the deal process moves forward. And, in an ideal situation, what you'd like to see is the team does their financial due diligence or legal due diligence or whatever it is, and they report that up the food chain, and those issues get addressed somewhere in the purchase agreement. And in an environment where you're moving very quickly through your diligence because you're under pressure to get something signed or get something closed, I think the issue becomes diligence may or may not identify something that ultimately does not get captured in a purchase agreement. And then you end up closing a deal, and post-close, these issues bubble up, and you're in a situation where the sellers will say, well, hey, we made the information available to you. You should have known about it. In fact, as part of the materials we put up in the data room or whatever access you had, and buyers are saying, well, yeah, but the purchase agreement says this, and we're supposed to get these protections, and whatever the issue is now, is no longer there. But I think that at least in the North America market, the mechanism buyers are using to protect themselves is the rep and warranty insurance. So, again, in North America, it's very common to pursue adjustments through working capital mechanisms or to pursue adjustments through, earnouts. But, if you go the working capital route and you can't get an adjustment because maybe the parties did agree to apply something consistent with historical practice, and even if the historical practice is not GAAP, you've agreed to be bound by that anyways. But there's typically a financial statement rep that's going to say, we prepare these historical statements in accordance with GAAP. And that's where the buyer now is going to make their claim. And that's where the rep and warranty policies are very important for a buyer as a protection against, these issues that maybe they knew about in diligence, maybe they uncovered, but they just didn't have time to investigate. And now that they've become an issue post-close, that's where they're going to make their claim and pursue their adjustment. And I will say this about the rep and warranty insurance, that environment has evolved quite a bit over the last several years. And the old statistic used to be for every 100 policies that get placed, 20 to 25 claims get filed. And of those 25 claims, maybe 20% of those actually receive a payment. And so when you do the math, you think, man, of every 100 policies, only 4 or 5% of policies are receiving a payment. But you have to remember that the rejection rate or the denial rate from the insurance companies is only like 1 or 2%. I mean, it's very low. And what's causing that is buyers are incentivized to file a claim to protect their rights under the policy. I think a lot of times after buyers do that, they undergo an investigation and they come to the conclusion that either there is no breach, or even if there is a breach, it's not worth pursuing further because the damages are not enough to make the cost worth the benefit, and buyers will withdraw their claim. So, buyers shouldn't think that just because they have a policy in place and they file a claim, they're going to get paid. I think what the market shows is that that's normally the first step that happens is the buyer will file the claim. But in reality, with time and investigation, I think a lot of buyers realize that there's either no claim there or the cost of pursuing the claim, it doesn't actually make it worth it.
All I'd add is that I don't think it's possible to say about due diligence issues anything kind of general or there's no homogeneous due diligence issue that applies all over it. It's usually something, almost by definition, it has to be something that serious people didn't think of. And so it's probably something that's a bit left field, and so it's going to be different each time. So I don't think you can kind of make a general rule as to, well, you make sure you do diligence in this particular way or in this particular area. It's more about just generally being open and thorough to potential issues and not being blind to them just so that you can get the deal done.
So the report concludes that the cost of ambiguity has never been higher. If you were advising a PE firm or a middle market CEO who is closing a deal tomorrow, what is the single most important contingency that they should nail down to stay out of a dispute?
I tend to advise my clients, it's not about staying out of the dispute. It's at least in, America, you can sue anybody at any time for any reason, right? So you can't avoid the dispute. But what you want to do is protect yourself so that if the dispute arises, you're at least well protected and you can fight back. And so I advise my clients to get people like Kevin and I involved as early in the process as you can, because the due diligence team, they're very smart. They've got, their extensive history with doing due diligence, but the due diligence process is different than the dispute process. And, 90% of all transactions or whatever, like there is no dispute on it, right? But Kevin and I get involved in that 10% where there is a dispute. So our entire experience has been, has evolved through understanding what do we see go wrong? How often do we see the same things come up? And what are the different, shades of gray with these issues? And how can I take that experience to the front end and advise my clients when they're structuring a purchase agreement? What type of language do we want in? And if we're defining certain terms, does it make sense to define a term this way or that way? And depending on if you're the buyer or the seller, that's going to have material implications of it. So my advice is get your dispute professionals involved, even if it's just reading a purchase agreement for an hour or two, to see if there's anything that jumps out to them because they've been through, they have that experience when the deals don't go well. And even if you can't avoid the dispute, at least they can give you advice on how to protect yourself from their experiences.
Just to add couple of specific points from my side. I've been talking about the earnout as a rising issue for a while, and so I definitely advise sellers to be very careful about accepting a major part of their consideration on the basis of an earnout that's 2 or 3 years out without a very good understanding of how the business will be structured at that point and to what extent are the terms that drive the consideration well defined and they're protected from manipulation by the buyer. One other point, you said the example would be someone who's about to close, but I think a lot of disputes, particularly in this macro environment, might be arising through conditions precedent not being met, and therefore, for example, the buyer being able to get out of closing the deal to the consternation of the seller. And you should definitely, as a buyer, as a seller, avoid the situation where the buyer is in control of those conditions precedent being met.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for answering all these questions and being on the podcast today. Frank and Kevin, appreciated the time.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.